Ladies and gentlemen, the play is The Thing with your host, Judy Sleed. Special guest, John Bouvier, Democratic candidate for Southampton Town Trustee. Now, here is Judy.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I have a wonderful guest who's a wonderful person, very interesting.
Thank you.
John Bouvier. Every time we hear that name, people think about Jackie.
Yes.
Is that because you are related to her?
I am. Jackie was my godmother and my cousin, and my father and her grew up together out in East Hampton. We used to play hide and seek around the windmill. And
So when people hear your name right away, they ask you?
not always.
No?
I spent a lot of my life trying to be anonymous because of it. It took me a while.
And perhaps today's generation don't remember that name,
That's
right?
true. Yeah, that's true. As time goes by, it gets a little less so. But in campaigning, I've never run for office before, so I'm finding that people actually remember her and the name
Right.
often with a lot of fondness, which really makes me feel really very proud and very happy.
So I met you at, that was some sort of a gathering, Democratic gathering?
It was the opening of the Democratic headquarters in Southampton. It's sort of a
Yes.
traditional thing. I'm not a consummate politician. This is all new to me as well. So
And that's where I met you. And then we got into a conversation about politics, I think. So you were telling me what you're running for, right?
yes.
Well, could you elaborate on that so everybody else will know?
Sure, absolutely. I'm running for Southampton Town Trustee, which is a job, one of the oldest independent body politics in the United States. It was actually established in 1686, I believe, under an authority of the King of England, under the Dongan Patent. And they were sort of the original town council, because this community is a maritime community for the most part. And at that time, they would set the regulations and how to harvest and all of that. And today, their function is stewards of our environment. I think they represent this form of checks and balances that we need to have a balance between development and protection of our bays and beaches, which are ultimately a large part of our economy here.
So basically what you do is the environment, right?
Yes, yeah.
You're trying to maintain the environment.
Well, we have,
That's what a trustee does?
That's what they do. They protect the bays and beaches. You've probably read a lot about issues with algal blooms and nitrogen loading and septic systems and issues that we have on the
Probably
beaches.
plastics.
And plastics and a whole host of things that sort of human activity has evolved into. And
all the debris on the beaches, right?
Yep, all of that. Well, and in particular with Sandy recently, with the hurricane, that we've come to understand the power of the ocean and the fact that we have rising sea levels and climate change. All these things are sort of coming to bear. So I think this board in particular, they're going to be under a lot of pressure in the coming decade to fight against these problems that are occurring. And that's one of the reasons I'm running, is that my background is in engineering, and I think the board needs to have people who have a background in science and technology, because I think that's what's going to ultimately solve the problems that we're faced with.
So you're like trying to contain the ocean in its bed, right?
Well, I mean, some people do, and they build very hard structures, and which I'm very opposed to. I would say to anybody who doesn't understand what I'm talking about is if you use Google Earth, it's a perfect example. You can take a virtual fly down the coast. You can go from Moriches Inlet to Montauk, and you could fly over the beaches, and you can see the effects of hardening beaches intermittently, where you have homes that people who are trying to protect their beachfront property, but without any responsibility for the people on either side of them. And what happens, you get very bad erosion on either side of that. And you can see it. It's very obvious when you sort of fly over with Google Earth or one of those types of things.
Isn't that like a very big job to correct that?
It is. I mean, we're right now undertaking a soft beach replenishment project. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management provides sand, and right now there's companies that are under contract to replenish the beaches, and most coastal geologists of good repute will say this is probably the best alternative that you have outside of moving homes and moving them off the beaches or back from the beaches as this erosion continues to take place. That seems to be the best alternative. In the state of Texas, arguably one of the most conservative states in the union, they have a law called the Texas Open Beaches Act, which states that if you take a risk as a homeowner having a house on the beach, and you assume that risk. So in Texas, the law says that if your house is sitting behind the dunes, you're fine. But if the dunes move behind your house and suddenly your house is sitting on the beach, you have a responsibility to move that house back, or the state will do it for you. And it's what it's done over time is created very creative people who have designed houses that are much more movable, and they consider that in the design of their homes on the beaches. So I think there's a balance to be found between these two things. I'm not advocating that everyone move their house back, but I do think that future homes that are built should have that in the back of their minds, and particularly working with architects and town codes and things like that, that these rules and regulations should sort of work together with homeowners in a way to prevent that from happening. Because ultimately, I think the argument would be that people, the taxpayer, will assume the burden, and I don't think any taxpayer would want to assume that burden. So there are actually, Southampton, I think, is progressive in a way. They've established environmental control zones, which are a group of homeowners who have banded together to pay to remediate the beaches in front of their homes without hardened structures.
Well, I think it's very romantic to have a house on the beach, but personally I would be afraid to live there because of all the things with the ocean. You know, you never know when it's going to come and, wash their house away. So I think everybody whose house is there, they should be aware, and they would want to move the house.
Oh, absolutely. And in some cases, it's not cost effective to do so, because the houses that are built were not built with that in mind. And that's really the only point I'm trying to make. I'm not trying to advocate that we all push our houses back. I think that we can control this with soft sand replenishment over time. But I think as new homes are built and old ones are taken down, that this has to be part of the thought process in any kind of building project. Because we all live here for a particular reason,
Because it's so beautiful.
It's beautiful, and
So
I don't
how
think putting
did you
groin.
get out here to work with this thing?
Well, as I was born in West Hampton. I went to school, kindergarten. I went to Remsenburg Kindergarten. I remember it was a red schoolhouse, but what I do remember is my mother in particular. She used to have an old jalopy kind of car, a Woody, and it had these springs on it, and she would haul us into the car, and we would run down to the she would drive us down to the end of the bay where we lived on Shore Road in Remsenburg, and we would go get clams and scallops, and we would get dinner. And I remember that even as a 5-year-old, how
So
wonderful that was.
even then you worked for your dinner.
Yes, we did. Yes, I did. Yeah. So it was, that was just something that I remember. That was part of my childhood dream. And later on, we moved. And when I came back, I went to high school here. We moved all over the world. And I came back, and this is in the context of the question that you asked me. I remember diving in Mauritius Bay as a kid, as a teenager. And I used to work underwater. I was a diver, a saturation diver, and built submarines and did a lot of stuff like that. And I wanted to show my daughter what I remembered. I wanted to have one of these days, father and daughter days, and I was really looking forward to it. And she was about 10 or 11, if I recall. And first time she'd had a mask on, which was about the same age I had been when I first had a mask on. And we went over the side. Nothing that I remember was there. And it turned into a great disappointment, and I realized that she's only going to think of a healthy bay in those terms. She's never going to know or believe anything that I told her that transpired before she got into the water for the first time. And we've accepted this over time, this slow degradation of our environment. It sort of happened under our nose. And we've accepted it because we don't really know any different from generation to generation. Now we do, and we have ways of remembering that, and I want to preserve that and roll that back. So if she can't see it, at least maybe my grandchildren can.
So that's what made you, it was a wake-up call.
Yeah, it was. Well, in the course of my career, too, I've been around the world a lot, and I've seen a lot of coastlines, and I've seen a lot of communities and how they've handled this problem. And some get big A for the job, and others get a terrible F. And depending on the community, how they've handled these problems is really stark. It's very apparent, and you can see
So you
it.
mentioned Texas is a good example, and what else? You mentioned
Well,
before
I don't
that
know if
you
it's a
were
good
in,
example. I think the legislation itself, I think it bears understanding that type of legislation, because that's a reaction to having houses on beaches that are going to be exposed to rising sea level, and what do we do as communities to do that? And there are horrifying pictures that brought that about in Texas, where they would take, in a lot of communities, they would dump cars. I mean, even we had some cars that were been dug up that had been placed in the beaches here in the 70s. They tried to do anything to sort of stop this advancement of erosion, which is a perfectly natural process. Our coastlines aren't static. They move in and out. Sea levels have been rising for a long time, very slowly, but now it's rising faster. We have issues with CO2 in our atmosphere and a lot of things that are affecting us environmentally, and it's accelerating to such a point where it's irrefutable. You can't ignore it. You can't deny it.
That's for sure.
So you have to do something about it.
You mentioned you were in France.
Yeah, well, when I was 5, my father worked at Grumman. He was a director of marketing, and he actually worked for the government. And in those days, you had 2 roles, and that was his official role. And we lived in Europe. I moved there when I was 5, and then we moved to Germany. I lived in Spain. I lived all over the place. I had a lot of exposure to different cultures and different methodologies. And it's interesting that you bring up Europe, because I often use that as an example when I campaign. That in Europe, the issue of nitrogen, which causes a lot of the algae blooms that you've read about, it's high nitrogen levels that come from septic systems and effluent that cause algae to bloom the way they do. And in Europe, they solved this problem about 30, 40 years ago because they had to. The Mediterranean was almost dead, and they had to solve the problem. And there are ways to remediate nitrogen in algae or nitrogen in the water. There are technologies that exist and companies that produce systems that do that. It's how you bear the cost. So I'll refer you to another piece of legislation, which is the Chesapeake Watershed Authority, which is floated bonds, which the individual taxpayer would not have to pay a large amount of money to repair their septic system, and I don't think they should be burdened with that. But by floating a bond, people were spending $60 to $70 a year to remediate their systems in a prioritized fashion, and they've solved the problem, or they're still working on the problem. But these are all sort of creative solutions to do all these things. And never having been interested in politics that much in my life, I suddenly find myself here because I write about this a lot, and I realize that it's political will that needs to get these problems solved. And political will comes from us, you and me, and everyone else, to push our elected officials and educate our elected officials. And that's part of what the trustees, I think that's part of their role, to be transparent and educate the public in a lot of these issues, so that we don't sort of react to myth, we react to science, and we react to data that we know is certain and is true.
So when you say you write, is that part of the politicking, or you write and you talk to people?
Well, that's always been me. I've always done that anyway. I used to take underwater photographs a lot, and I used to write a lot about what I saw, and I love to write. My daughter's a great writer as well. Lately, I've been writing about this particular issue in our local paper as it relates to our community, because I think it's important. I think it's a good way for people to come up to speed on some of these problems and understand them.
When you say you write a letter to the editor? Or you
Letters to the
write
editor, yeah.
Articles?
Yeah, well, I sometimes write viewpoints. I will reveal to you now, I'm secretly writing a book about sort of my experiences, because as I talk to people such as yourself, and I learn a lot, and I meet really interesting people, and I find that really fascinating, and their approaches, and behind every door that I go to,
So how long have you been writing this book?
Well, a few years now. I sort of start and stop often. When I have material, I add to it. It's just sort of, to me, it's very fascinating, the process on how we govern ourselves. I'm an engineer, a very practical person. I consider myself a very practical person, but I also love the aesthetics of design, so I have a creative side to me too. So I'm a bit of a blend of those two things.
So you said you were an engineer. Was that your first job?
It was. When I came back, when we moved back from Europe, I was in high school here in West Hampton, and I got into my Datsun truck, and I was inspired by Jacques Cousteau. I used to watch the Jacques Cousteau things all the time, and that's what I wanted to be. That was since I was very young. I think since that first experience with my mother getting clams, it was sort of that first wallowing around in the mud and pulling the clams up and
with your toes.
With my toes, yeah, or any way I could. I was 5, and I would find any way I could. And I was inspired by that. So I actually went to California, went to school in California, but sort of my education was sidetracked. It was an extended education, because I sort of went to school and worked and put myself through school as I did these things. But I went to work for a gentleman named Al Giddings, who's the guy who filmed The Abyss and Jaws. And he was outfitting a ship called it was the RV Eagle. It was previously the USS Tanager. And so I just drove. I had met Sylvia Earle, who was a woman who headed NOAA, and they had formed a foundation called the Deep Ocean Foundation. And I met her at a lecture, and we got to talking, much like you and I met. And I said, this sounds really good. And I was, 18 years old, and I said, this is where I'm going, And of course, my parents wanted me to go to school, but I said, well, I'll certainly go to school, but I really want to go do this. And I drove off and went and lived on board ship. And things sort of started from there. And previously had gone to dive school. I went to dive school at Harbor Branch, so I was a commercial diver, worked underwater because that was part of my Jacques Cousteau dream. So I thought that was my credential to get myself introduced to Mr. Giddings, that, I had this background, and I trained with Mark V helmets. Probably the ones that are the old brass helmets, with the face plates and the chin buttons and the big canvas suits and the heavy, and the whole thing weighed about 300 pounds, and, it was very, so I went to school for that, and.
You went to school?
Yeah, I went to dive school. Yeah.
So are you planning on changing gears again after this, or you want to stay in politics?
Well, I don't know if I'm in politics. There is a problem that's in front of us that has a solution, and as an engineer, I'll tell you the solution is there. So I'm not sure it's politics that I'm in. I know that I have to work in a political environment in order to accomplish something. This is something that should transcend politics. I don't think we should politicize our environment. I don't think we should politicize our children. These are certain, it's just principles that I have.
Yes, we have to look ahead. Right.
So I don't know. I think I told you previously, my father always used to accuse me of making a career out of jumping into swimming pools without checking whether there was water in it. And I think sometimes we need to go out on faith a little bit and take some risk, and that's the only way we move forward. If we're overly cautious, as we may be now, because we're talking about issues that we've understood for the last 10 or 20 years, and we over-debate something, we miss the opportunity to fix it. And
well, it's good to remind people that, this is what's happening, and let's do something about it.
Yeah, yeah,
That's the only way you'll get it done.
I agree. And that pertains to a lot of stuff.
Right, because
yeah.
if you don't know anything about it, you're not going to fix it.
Exactly right, and the problems are not so super complex, and we're really blessed in this area. We have, you know, the Southampton, the new SOMAS Center, the Marine Atmospheric Center that just opened with Stony Brook campus in Southampton. We have Cornell. I raise oysters with the Cornell SPAT program. They have for community gardens, and I think it's a really great program, and I think everybody should join it. It's a couple of $100, and you get 1,000 spat or oysters, and you grow them in cages, and it's run by a guy named Kim Tetrault, who I think is just a really fascinating guy. He's sort of a Zen bass player, but he's very, very knowledgeable in this area. He's been doing it for a long time, and he runs that program, and he does a very, very good job. And you learn. He gives lectures, and they're not boring lectures. They're exciting, interesting lectures. And he talks about things, everything from the biology of raising shellfish to the cultural ways of having shellfish around the world. So he does a very good job, makes it very interesting. So all the people in the SPAT program who I've met, I feel like I have kindred spirits. I've met kindred spirits. We all get along. We all have the same beliefs.
And when do you have time to play your, was it guitar you said?
Not too often. I'd like to play more. It's a little tough, running a campaign. I think, luckily, it's only a few months out of your life. But
When you go talk to people, can't you just go and play?
no, I should be the troubadour campaigner.
Yes.
I don't know how that would work.
Well, I don't know how to say this, but I don't have my clock in front of me, so I don't know how much time I have left. 4 minutes?
Oh, well, I can talk 45 more
Yeah,
minutes
I
with
know.
you, Judy.
They usually have a timer up there, so I know how to guide my, time here, but it isn't there. So before we go, I want to say that I want to mention that I had my hair done at Lupita, the hair salon. I always go there before I come in the air. I want to look gorgeous.
You should have a sign sponsored by.
Yeah, and I want to thank all my underwriters, and some of them I remember by. I know my daughter Judy Sleed and Taylor Cohen, and the two fish stores, and Scott. And I'm sorry, but you all know the names are going to come up at
will
the
flash
end.
down
At
the
the
screen,
end,
all right.
yes. And you could watch me here at 5 days a week here at LTV, and you could watch me in Manhattan at 5:30 p.m. on Tuesday. And LTV, well, of course, LTV, YouTube, 200 of my shows are uploaded. So, as I
Well-
say, I'm famous.
You're all over the place.
Yes.
Well, I just want to thank you very much for, it was a real pleasure meeting you when we originally met, so I was looking forward to
Well,
talking
it was
with you.
very enlightening, and you really talked about things that are important, and I'm glad, as you were telling everybody, I learned a lot also.
Great.
I mean, I've heard all about this erosion and all that, but I couldn't figure out how to,
Well, I have a website.
Fix it.
A website. It's johnbouvier.org, O-R-G, so you can, anyone who's watching can look that up. And we have a lot of that information that you and I were talking about. We have that there as a resource for the voter to check out and learn more. And I'm just a firm believer that the more people know, the more they get involved, and the more that creates political will to do something.
Right.
And that's really the whole reason for me running, and the opportunity to tell people that. It's great, and I appreciate
And
it.
who's the main contributor for this program?
For the trustees, you mean? Or-
Yeah.
Well, the trustees are actually have a budget. It's roughly $700,000 a year. And if you consider the trustees are 5 people who have responsibility for over half the town of Southampton, which is water. It's a very light budget if you look at that in consideration of the budget for the town council. They get budget money from the town, but they also raise money when it's needed. And it's a group of people who are passionate about these subjects that we're talking about. And while we may have disagreements in the methodology of solving the problem, I think the one thing that we all agree on is that we want to solve the problem.
Yeah, you have to solve it. I'm sure the more people you have, the more disagreements you're gonna have.
Yeah.
That's the way
That's
it is.
that's the American way, and that's the way it
Yes,
should be. We should have an open, honest debate about things, but then there's a time to stop and make decisions and move ahead before it's too late. And I'm not saying it's too late, but I am saying that there is a window of opportunity here that we have. It's about a decade, in my view.
And you have to get started, at least get started.
Yes, you do, and work well with other entities because it's a regional issue. It's not just us here, it's coast up the East Coast of the United States. We have problems with our drinking water. There's a bi-county aquifer commission that's being formed. And these are all things that we need to be doing and work hard at, together.
Together. Yes. Well, it's been wonderful having you here, and you're a very good guest.
Well, thank you. You're a great hostess. You absolutely are. You make me feel welcome and warm, so thank you very much.